And the idea is to bring you in the next 40 minutes or so, probably a bit less, in order to have you some of your questions, to show you how the regulation in Chile has shifted from a state-owned, without unliberalized market towards more liberalization, probably less than Australia, probably less than the UK and some other countries, and how results have moved and shifted from good results, and they have to be improved after a while. This is the outline that I'm going to talk about. It's first to show you how the electricity model is. We have some similarities with the Philippines. We are a bit isolated from our neighbors, although we are in South America. I'll talk about some of the regulatory landmarks or milestones that we had in the last almost 40 years. And I'm going to focus finally in the generation activity and talk about how the reforms have evolved, how the results have appeared, and tricky. Thank you. So, and how the recent reforms have developed. Okay, first of all, some facts of Chilean electricity and Chile in general. Chile is a very long country. We have almost 4,000 kilometers from north to south. I was talking in lunch from one of our neighbors. Although they all speak Spanish, that's easy. We are all former Spanish colonies. They're not very good neighbors in general. Sometimes we fight. Sometimes it's been a while since we haven't fought, but it's hard for us to make good energy partners, I would say. So, probably last night, some of you may have seen a show on the TV. I was able to see it was 1 hour documentary about Chile, something called Pony on something, Pioni. But for a while, we've had two large electrical systems. One in the north, that you may see it, it's Peru and Bolivia. It's an electricity system where most of our large users are. Our large users are mostly mining companies that produce mostly copper, but where the population is very small. It's almost 6% of the population, despite that it's almost 1/3 of the country. It's it's almost a desert there. Then we have a large central interconnected system where most of the people live, as you may see. And then we have isolated electrical systems down south, next to the Strait of Magallanes. You may know that guy. And also in the Patagonia, Chilean Patagonia, which is a very mountainous area, although very few people live there. Those are isolated systems, medium-sized. Also medium-sized electrical system is the electrical system of the Easter Island. It's in the middle of the Pacific, very isolated from everywhere. Our population is almost 17 million, according to the recent census, and our total electrical capacity is 20,000 megawatts. We have different inputs for electricity. We are not oil producers. Most of the rest of South American countries are producers of oil or natural gas. We don't produce at all oil or gas. We have some carbon, but it's underground carbon, so not more. But we have waters, we have rivers and dams for a while. Fossil fuels are used for many generation firms. We've had some experience trying to develop nuclear plants, but we are a country with big earthquakes and consequent tsunamis. So that kind of technology is forbidden since Fukushima's accident 6 years ago. We have big opportunities for renewable energies. Almost 30% of capacity right now is from solar and wind and water dams, but also some geothermal activity in Chile. This has been a result of some recent reforms, I would say the last 10 years, trying to promote and incentivize this kind of technologies. And we have very little commerce with our neighbors, electricity commerce. Some natural gas for a while, but not anymore. We have big pollution in our cities. Particulate matter is a situation of concern. I would say going back in all the system from Santiago, which is in the middle of the country, until probably over Coyhaique system. I would say 2,000 kilometers. All cities have air pollution problems due to the use of biomass for and well, diesel from vehicles is a problem. Particulate matter, NOx, SO2 are a problem. So this is also a growing concern and problem for fossil generation and for some industries. They have shifted their procedures and their processes. And also an interesting fact is since this year, in January 1, we have a carbon tax that is applied to generation. It's $5 per ton of carbon. And it's also added a local air pollutant tax also since this year that has affected some generators, I would say diesel generators. But so far, it hasn't affected the dispatch of the wholesale market operator. Probably this carbon tax is going to affect long-term contracts. We're not sure how, but it may affect. So that's an area probably different to the Australian regulation that they had some issues with carbon taxes. We have a carbon tax right now. How it's going to move in the next years, it's something of debate. The reform in Chile was started almost 40 years ago after the crisis of the 70s, oil crisis. My country had to start thinking how to reform the electricity market, in general the energy sector. So some key principles were started to discuss. First, trying to introduce competition where possible. This is very straightforward and a bit odd right now, but they were a bit revolutionary in those days. Regulate only if market failure existed. Prices should try to reflect costs and try to avoid, therefore, cross-subsidies between users. We try to promote private investment, and some firms that had been nationalized in the early 70s were started to become privatized. This is I would say, the key facts of our regulation, and most of them, I would say, were established in the electricity law of 1992. So it has been 35 years since then, and the law and the principles have changed and amended, but we'll see it later. In specific terms, in electricity terms, the Chilean reform established a program for marginal cost rate for residential users. It liberalized price for large consumers. That's something we were discussing in the panel previously. So users or consumers that have a consumption over 2 megawatts of installed capacity, were able to get liberalized prices, unregulated prices. Also, at the origin of the reform, it was a need to design a center of economic dispatch, what you here call the WESM, wholesale energy something. Every single country has a different name for this, as a system operator. Tolls have to be, of transmission lines have to be shared by users, and some unbundling between generation, transmission, distribution activities have to occur. Quality requirements for utilities, especially distribution utilities, were established later, but it was an issue for a while, almost 15 years without regulation of quality. What have been the results of these reforms? Several authors consider that the reforms in general were well oriented. one specific characteristic of our regulation is it's very detailed in the law. For a while, the electricity law, which was very short in general, was very specific. So, for instance, the rate of regulation for electricity firms was established in the law, so it was 10% annual. This has been good and bad. Of course, some authors, for instance, Brian Levy and Paulo Spiller, considered these kind of rules in a study that was also for the telecommunications sector, and where they also assessed Philippines regulation, I can recall, said that in Chile, the clear and stable rules were able to guarantee investment in regulated industry, which is something very relevant in the early 80s. Chile, at that time, was governed by a military dictatorship. Actually, it was the first time I've heard, when I was small and a kid, of the Philippines, because our former dictator, Augusto Pinochet, was traveling to Philippines. And his plane wasn't able to land in the Philippines. So that was the first time I heard from the Philippines, and I said, well, this country is doing something for us. We're under that military dictatorship, very severe, and they said, well, this guy cannot land in the Philippines, in Manila, so it was something. It appears in the books of history, recent history, that our dictator was impeded to land in the Philippines. Well, that was the first time. Then I start to hear about the Aquinos and stuff like that. That was the first time. Well, also another author mentioned previously by a professor here, David Newberry, said that in case of Chile, rules were too specific. And that could be, this is very strange for economists, because this guy, Professor Newberry, is arguing mostly because the lack of good judicial review at the time, early 80s, military dictatorship, courts were not doing their duty, of course. They weren't enforcing human rights. So if they were not enforcing human rights, you can maybe discuss how they were going to argue with our electricity regulator. Most of them actually came from the military, so that was hard. So at the time, regulatory legislation, very specific, was good. Although, however, Professor Gomez Ibanez said that this kind of solution, very specific, was good, but it's a provisional solution to the problem of, again, administrative law discretion of regulators. This is good as long as you don't have an independent regulator. So if you don't have a good independent regulator, or this kind of very detailed regulations may be good for you. However, of course, there's a problem, especially when force majeure situations appear, or unforeseen events happen, and you're not able to solve these problems with the specific rules. And that has happened in Chile. The reform started in the late 70s, I was mentioning, and for a while the law and the regulators, we have different regulators trying to deal with themselves, actually was enough. System operator was created in 1985, and our first big amendment of the law came in 1990s, just after actually privatization, and the solution to the transmission problem was, well, we're not going to be able to what the law said that third bird axis was freely negotiated. So and that didn't work. So the first regulation to transmission came in the 1990s, and also we had a big problem, probably anticipating climate change. We had a severe rationing, blackouts due to severe droughts. And that was the situation just before democracy returned in Chile in 1990. However, competition authorities in the 1980s, especially in the 90s, started to develop a new role. They started to mention and discuss and complain about how some monopoly regulation or some monopolies were granted by law or by rule first, and also some areas that were not treated in laws or regulations, both of gas, natural gas, I would say, and electricity, were not dealt. For instance, in the 1996, as you may see, the competition authorities challenged the open access to gas pipelines, and also discussed seriously the accumulation of water rights by one of the largest generator. Actually, at that time, the generator was going to be sold to Spanish investors, Endesa. And when it was privatized in the 80s, it was privatized with most of the water rights in order to build water dams. The next year, 1997, just actually after Endesa was sold to Spanish, again the competition authority issued a recommendation. This was sort of an advocacy discussing the vertical integration that at that point was allowed in the law, but saying, well, this vertical integration between the largest generation company, largest transmission company, and largest distribution company was no good for the consumer. And also promoting public tendering for distribution companies' electricity supply. In 1998 came the first electricity regulation, and well, that was enough. 1995, after a new severe drought, the enforcement agency, the Superintendency of Electricity and Fuels, actually got more powers from the parliament, and suddenly something happens in the early 2000s. This is what happened. Most of our natural gas plants, most of our generation was from carbon and diesel, but in the late 90s, some international gas pipelines were built with Argentina, 3 gas pipelines. So natural gas plants started to function. But suddenly an Argentinian crisis started to produce natural gas shortages. Although we had long-term contracts and fair tradition with Argentina, the change of their authorities decided that they were going to cut the supply of natural gas to our electricity facilities. So those are the results. No? So some of the investment, or most of the 1990s investment, had to change their fuel from natural gas to diesel, with some difficulties, of course, and air quality issues. But this was a regulatory problem for the government. This was an unforeseen event. This was a force majeure case, and we had to do something. The previous year, 2004, after some problems in transmission, a new transmission law was enacted. It created an expert panel for dispute resolution, and sort of a court integrated, of course, funnily, I would say, with only 2 lawyers, and the rest of the 5 members are both economists or engineers, so lawyers are in a minority there. That's unusual. And something of interest is this law also created a specific regulation for medium-sized electrical systems, recognizing that in those cases, vertical integration can be good, but it needs price regulation and a pricing system similar to what is used in water utilities, actually. Well, in the last 10 years, we've seen many reforms in trying to promote public tendering for electricity supply, promoting renewable energies, creating a Ministry of Energy, and so on and so forth. In the last 2 years, we've seen a review of both the transmission regulation and the public tendering. In distribution, the situation is the following. Every firm has a concession. There are natural monopolies, of course, and the rates that they trespass to consumers in the distribution are calculated since 1992 using what is called an efficient or model firm. This is a pretty straightforward system. It's calculated every 4 years. Consultants produce studies that are weighted 2/3 for the study of the regulator and 1/3 to the study of the distribution company. And the result of this brings what is called the distribution added value, VAD, and those are the rates of the distribution companies. And distribution utilities have to trespass as a pass-through, their PPAs to consumers. So it's very relevant how they acquire their contracts. And supposedly, competition in retail was only unlimited to consumers that got over 2 megawatts of installed capacity. In transmission, also natural monopoly, and I would focus mostly on generation, but also we've had reforms in 2004 and 2016, moving towards more regulation, more planning, and creating or changing actually the pricing of transmission from towards a stamp method. That's how right now it's working in my country. What about the generation and supply business? This is going to something. The assumption here in the 1980s was, well, this is a market with rivalry. Of course, these were assumptions that were not tested, I would say. They sounded very well and very straightforward to the creators of the law. Some of them have been consultants to countries such as Ghana, Peru, Colombia. So our problems have been copied, or I wouldn't say copied, but exported actually. So if you have problems, and if you say that the assumption is that clients may build their own facilities, it won't happen. It has started to happen very recently, but only recently, not in 1982. There were no barrier to entries. Some concessions were required by law, some permits, but they don't have a monopoly characteristic. And well, as something that had happened in 2004, regulated rates for vertically integrated medium-sized systems have been taking place, but it's only for since 2004, as mentioned. The system operator is something that was, I wouldn't say created. Some of the people in Chile said they created this system, but that was in the early 80s. No internet, so trying to create something from scratch. The system operator called until, well, it has also it's a part of the alphabet now. It was called SEDEC, the Economic Dispatch Center. For a while, it's changed its name, and it was reformed last year. From its priorities, safety, produce an economic dispatch, and open access to transmission grid. The last one hasn't been fulfilled for a while. It has started to fulfill only in the last 10 years or so. But this is an economic dispatch. It's a merit dispatch focused on physical production, not on contracts. That's something different from other countries. From scratch in 1982 until 2005, the price between generators and where generators are also suppliers, they contract with distribution companies, was price regulated by the authority. It was called the node price. It was a price calculated every 6 months. It looked at the prices for the next 4 years, and it was tested with the contracts of the free market, of the liberalized market, where supposedly there was competition. However, some of those contracts were indexed to the regulated price, so there was a circular problem there. But in 2005, after this crisis and shortage from Argentinian gas, we had to think about how to attract new investment. And it was an investment in generation not attracted because of trying to bring more competition, but trying to have safe security of supply. That was the purpose, and that was the whole purpose of the law enacted at that time. I was part of that process, and I can tell you that competition issues and how to design a good tender wasn't the problem. It was trying to have new investment. So the new legislation was approved by Congress very, very fast. It was a fast track approval from Congress. And from these regulated prices, calculated every 6 months, with a lot of discretion from the authority, we moved towards tendering prices from this public auction, contracts lasted for 15 years, and you had to have a PPA before 3 years before the cease of the previous PPAs, and this was the detail. The devil lies in the details. These were an informed price appeared. There was a price cap, but known to the bidders before the tender took place. This was the problem, as I will tell you right away. And the prices from these auctions would not affect the marginal cost calculated by our system operator. There were problems also because some distribution companies didn't have supply contracts. That was a problem that we exported to other countries such as Peru, for instance. Well, there were some assumptions in this reform that were, of course, assumptions. No, as you will see in they were supposed to happen many things that didn't happen actually. For instance, the delay in investment in generation was supposed to last only 3 years. Why 3 years? Because in those days, environmental authorization, in 3 years you could get a plant built. Nowadays it's probably double this time because you have more opposition. Local communities oppose to some of transmission and generation projects. It was also an assumption that distribution companies would design good tender rules. They had some know-how, but well, they didn't have the right incentives to do it. It was supposed that the price cap was going to protect consumers and customers, but it didn't. It was supposed that new rules would promote long-term PPAs. Well, they did promote long-term PPAs, but not the best prices, as you'll see. And it was supposed to happen that large user would still purchase at unregulated prices. What happened? Well, this is the story. These are the results of the reforms. This is very, very good to see. You may see bids from tenders from 2006 until, well, 2014 and 2015 were also years that are considered, but this is part of the diagnosis of the government 10 years after the reform took place. You may see the cap price in that column and how it started to go up. The bid price also went up, and the amount of energy auction, well, the first year was very attractive, so 12,000 gigawatts was very, very attractive. Some problems were, of course, not only on the bidding price, but also on the index price. So you could have a very good price, you could have an excellent price at the bid price, but after you applied many indexes, well, the situation changed. So auctioning only by energy price didn't take a look at the index price, and some things may happen after a while, for instance. But what you can see clearly is that the prices doubled in less than 10 years. This was a big problem. Also, the cap price and the bid price started to almost stick to the price cap. That was another problem. Well, what were the results? You already saw some results there, but what were other results? Well, the uncertainty in power prices persisted for a while. Market concentration continued, so the largest three players continued to be the largest three players. They were the ones that had installed capacity. They were the incumbents in 2004, and they are still the incumbents, although more competition has started to appear. The tendering prices got stuck to the price cap. And also bidders consider this price cap as sort of a legal right. They say, well, since there's a price cap and if it's known, why not go to that price? It's like something like Professor saying this thing briefly. It wasn't a legal right, but they thought about that. Another problem was that new investment faced strong opposition in most of the electricity projects, whether it's transmission and generation. We've seen big problems of local communities, NGOs, indigenous people arguing against this issue. But also another assumption was that, well, the liberalized market would continue to be, and that large consumers would buy at better prices, but it didn't happen. What happened really is that users that had over 2 megawatts capacity decided to split their installed capacity so they could be understood or camouflaged as regulated users. So they could avoid getting better regulated prices that the distribution companies got when they tendered their supply. Well, after this diagnosis, what happens in 2014 and 15? Well, first, it was seen as that the state had retrained, and it had to reappear the state. They had the state, the energy regulator, knows the demand, knows when it's best to design or create a new public process, tendering process. So the states started to participate again. Utilities should always have a PPAs. We had a situation where some utilities and many utilities didn't have PPAs, but were taking energy from the system. That was something strange. Another assumption is, since liberalization for large consumers hadn't worked properly, some ways that the large consumers eluded the regulations were eliminated, and the limit was raised to 5 megawatts from 2 megawatts previously. The National Energy Commission was going to lead the tendering process, and well, this price cap that was previously known before the tender was hit, in order, of course, not to favor collusion. This is something that may happen there were no accusations of that kind, but well, if it's not collusion, it was to favor competition, I would say. Sounds much better, no? Some possible transfer of excessive supply between distribution companies was ordered, and well, this is an area that may bring new challenges, is that since we're now auctioning for 20-year contracts, probably the judicial revision or an arbitration revision of the PPAs coming from unforeseen events may happen. For instance, this tax carbon that was been established, or future changes in tax carbon. Now it's $5 per ton. It may be raised in the near future. What have been the results so far? This is something interesting. If you see, well, this is not that interesting. This is much more interesting. This is a result of what happened first from the number of bidders and from the prices. This is data from the National Energy Commission, and shows how, well, the number of bids for only one process. This is the 2016 process over there. 12,000 gigawatts were auctioned in one single auction, and the authority received, well, you can see how from 4 bids in the 2006, 10 years later, we are receiving 84 bids. Of course, this has created some, Schumpeter would say, creative destruction. Some firms have gotten away and run away from the Chilean system. Some of these firms, some of them were bluffing probably, but anyway, from 4 to 84 sounds pretty good. And the prices they were already going down. They were going down in 2004 and 2015. Were already, part of these regulations were being discussed at Congress, and also transmission regulations. So establishing a stamp method favors some renewable energies that had to pay a lot in transmission tolls. So these are good results. Well, a new auction was finished last week, actually. So this is why you can see the amount, but not the bid price. It hasn't been opened yet. The auction. We'll see how the prices are. Probably going to see less bids. Well, shortly, what are the regulation key facts, but updated now from some time? No? Well, competition was possible, was okay, but liberalization hasn't worked that way. I mean, we have to review. We have to test that hypothesis to the facts, and some regulation created or some illusion of the regulation created the incentives to run away from competition, actually. No? So we have to recognize that. We still regulate when market failure exists. Prices should reflect cost, of course. We try to avoid cross subsidies, but last week new electric equity started to favor users that paid a lot in some areas. So distribution rates now are cross-subsidized between urban consumers to rural consumers. We still promote private investment, as you've seen, from 4 to 84 bids. We're promoting private investment, but well, nowadays we have our national petroleum company. It was an old company. We don't have any petrol at all. We don't have fuel, but this state-owned firm has been promoting natural gas ports, geothermal. After a while, it started a couple of months ago, their geothermal plant. And since this year, they are also able to act as a power generator. So that may bring a new a new state-owned firm with a bigger role in investing. If there are any lessons to see from the Chilean regulation, first of all, I would say, well, you have to review the regulatory reforms with how effective they are. I would say that. From theory to practice, things change a lot. The tender design, creating this price cap, obviously it was going to favor higher prices, and it happened. But assessing this after 10 years probably comes because, well, there were some entrenched problems at the legislative, but certainly the devil lies in some of the details. Now, retail competition, well, we'll see. We'll see how this works, but certainly right now large consumers don't have ways to elude the fulfillment of the law, and they are forced to contract their PPAs. And there has been a big role of competition authorities detecting problems in unregulated areas, and in some cases of whether reliability or abuse of dominant position, they have been bringing cases at the competition courts, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, and not as much this decade, actually. And, well, that would be it. Thank you very much.